Ooh, kind of bright. Hi, y'all. My name's Dalton Lane. I'm a state chair here in Texas, and as well as a chapter president for the University of Houston. The next person that I'm about to introduce is a true hero in the liberty movement. He's a journalist, constitutional lawyer, and author of four New York Times best-selling books, both based on politics and law. His most recent book, No Place to Hide, is about the U.S. surveillance state and his experiences reporting on the Snowden documents around the world. He has had columns at the Guardian and Salon. He was the debut winner of the Park Center I.F. Stone Award for Independent Journalism in 2008, and also received the 2010 Online Journalism Award for his investigative work on the abusive detention conditions of Chelsea Manning. He also recently just won an Oscar for a documentary, Citizenfour. It's a real pleasure that I'd like to introduce Mr. Glenn Greenwald.
Hey, everybody, thanks. Thank you so much. Thank you. Hey, good afternoon, and thanks so much for that really warm reception, and thanks to Dalton for those nice introductory remarks. And thank you as well to the Future of Freedom Foundation and Young Americans for Liberty for inviting me here to speak. I was really glad, and am really glad, to have been able to accept for a bunch of different reasons. The most important one of which is that I've spoken with Jacob and the foundation on several occasions before. I've spoken to Young Americans for Liberty before, and so I feel like a little bit like I've almost found a refuge for what has been a really strange, I would actually even go so far as to say bizarre week of travel that I've had. I began traveling, I think, 8 or 9 days ago now. And the very first thing I did was I appeared for a full hour on the Glenn Beck program. And immediately after that, I delivered a keynote address to a group in Dallas that's headed by the former Republican Congressman Allen West. And just a couple of days ago, I found myself in Utah, at the University of Utah, just a couple of miles away from the brand new sprawling NSA facility in Bluffdale, Utah, where I went to speak about surveillance and privacy. And so it's been a very strange week, not the kinds of places where I typically expect to find myself, but I actually think that it illustrates a pretty important point. A point specifically about the work that I've been doing over the last 2 years on surveillance and privacy and secrecy, but also about political questions more generally. We are so often told that there are these really cleanly definable political categories into which we all have to place ourselves, left versus right, or liberal versus conservative, or Democrat versus Republican, and that where you are in these categories defines how you view essentially every single issue. And that beyond that, when you're in one of these boxes, it means that you have almost nothing in common with people who are in the other boxes, that you're just irreconcilably destined to be at each other's throats and to find almost no common ground. And there are a lot of issues for which that's true, but there are an enormous number of issues for which it's absolutely false. And I think it's really important to take stock of the ways in which that's true. So if you look at the two most significant protest movements that have arisen in the United States, probably since the era of the anti-war protests during the Vietnam War, the two really significant protest movements that took place outside of the two-party system were, on the one hand, the Tea Party movement, which is perceived to be on the right, and then the other is the Occupy Wall Street movement that's perceived to be on the left. And it really is true that they ended up at much different destinations. The Tea Party movement essentially ended up as this very diluted, co-opted arm of the Republican Party, really just a rebranding campaign more than a true ideological movement. And I think Occupy Wall Street ended up very diluted as well through a combination of excessive police force and subservient courts that put an end to the peaceful assembly rights that they were exercising. But if you look at how they actually began at the start, the genesis for each movement was much more similar than they were different. If you went to some of those early Tea Party protest movements, as I did, or to the Occupy Wall Street encampments, as I also did, what you found was that the overriding grievance of each was actually the same. It was anger over the fact that in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, the US government, both political parties, establishments, acted to protect the interests not of ordinary Americans who were victimized by that financial crisis, but by the very Wall Street tycoons who had caused it. They were really movements that were born out of anger over the bailout of Wall Street, each of them in almost exactly the same ways. And there's lots of other examples. When Congressman Ron Paul, with whom I was just speaking backstage, went to finally be able to take his dream of auditing the Fed and convert it from a fantasy into a reality, he teamed up with one of the most left-wing members of Congress, Alan Grayson, and they formed this bipartisan coalition that finally enabled a bill to get passed that subjected the Fed to at least some degree of accountability and transparency. And if you look at the clearly rapidly growing opposition to mass incarceration and the war on drugs, it is very difficult, I think, to categorize that as either a movement of the right or the left. You probably have an equal measure opposition on both ends of that spectrum, which is really one of the only reasons why it's now starting to finally become potent. And it certainly has been the case. That has certainly been true with the work that I've been doing over the past almost 2 years now with the Snowden Archive and against the issue and question of mass surveillance. It's been almost irrelevant in terms of looking at predictive metrics, how somebody reacts to these things, to know whether they're a Republican or a Democrat or a liberal or a conservative. That actually tells me almost nothing about what is your most likely perspective on issues of surveillance. It's definitely true that a lot of support for the reporting we've done and for the disclosures that Edward Snowden made came from the left, but a huge amount came from the right. In fact, the very first national public official who ever contacted me about Edward Snowden was, I think, 2 or 3 weeks after we first unveiled him to the world, and I got an email from the former 2-term, very conservative senator from New Hampshire, Gordon Humphrey, who emailed me and said, please tell Mr. Snowden that I regard him as both a patriot and as somebody who did something extremely noble. And when there was the first bill introduced in Congress after we began the reporting, a bill to defund the entire NSA bulk collection of Americans, that program, which was inconceivable since 9/11, the idea that there would be a bill introduced to defund an entire Pentagon program that was justified in the name of counterterrorism. That had been impossible until very recently. And when that bill was introduced, it had 2 primary sponsors. One was the first-term Tea Party Republican conservative congressman from Michigan, Justin Amash. And his partner in that was the, I think, like 58th term African-American liberal member of Congress from Detroit, John Conyers. And they attracted this enormously broad-based coalition of Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, and lots of different people in between. And the only reason that didn't end up passing was because this unholy trinity of the Obama White House, Nancy Pelosi, and John Boehner, the sort of 3-headed defense of the Washington establishment, joined together and whipped up enough votes to barely defeat it. And I think that, the reason why that's true is because the questions raised by those issues, how much do you trust the government to decide which of your communications it's going to invade? Or what is the value of privacy in the digital age? Or what are the dangers of vesting the state with massive authority that they exercise in the dark, are really not questions susceptible to these traditional partisan or ideological divisions. And that, to me, is one of the most enduring aspects of that debate, and I think one of the most inspiring. And I think what it really underscores is that one of the ways that people who wield political power stay in power, one of the ways that they keep the citizenry weak, is by dividing people as much as possible and convincing them that they have no common ground and that there's no basis for them to work together, because then they end up divided and fighting one another instead of unified and fighting the people who are actually wielding power. And that's one of the reasons why I think it actually is important to note here, and it's something that I say whenever I speak at any left-wing organization or just some more vaguely liberal event, is that I think it's really in our interest that when we do activism or when we gather at events like this to talk about things like the war on terror and the war on drugs, that we do everything we can to avoid that kind of atomization so that we don't only end up talking to people just like us. Because when we do that, we actually make ourselves much weaker. There are enormous numbers of people and very effective groups filled with experts who are African American or from communities of color or who are Muslim American, who advocate as effectively and eloquently as anybody the reasons why the war on terror and the war on drugs are linked and why they both need to be stopped and defeated. And I think we're always much stronger. And I say that there and I say that here when we think about the ways that we're being purposely divided and how much stronger we would be if we actually integrated those efforts in the way that coalitions require. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the work that I've been doing over the past 20 months and how it relates to the topic of this conference, the war on terror and the war on drugs. As I indicated earlier, I actually did a couple of nationwide trips with the Future of Freedom Foundation. We went around to college campuses on 2 separate occasions and spoke to various campuses, in part organized by Young Americans for Liberty, in part organized by some liberal organizations. And we talked a lot about civil liberties. And that was sort of before I got consumed by doing the work on privacy and surveillance that I've been doing for the last 2 years. And when I first started doing events like this and talking about the Snowden reporting, I conceived of it and therefore spoke about it in terms of those narrow issues. What is the value of privacy? What is the danger of government surveillance? And my thinking on those questions about what the true significance of the Snowden revelations have been have really evolved. And therefore, the way in which I talk about these issues has changed pretty dramatically. It has really broadened. Because ultimately, I actually don't think that the most significant questions that ended up being debated for the first time as a result of these revelations have been about privacy and surveillance. I actually think they're much broader than that. I think they're about the proper role of journalism in democracy, the threat of government secrecy, the role that the United States plays in the world, the way in which President Obama's image is so fundamentally different than his actions. I think there's been a very sweeping sort of debate that has happened far beyond those specific topics. And one of the questions that I get asked all the time in pretty much every single interview that I do, not just in the United States, but around the world about these issues is, this is probably the question I get more than any other. Journalists are very predictable. They ask the same questions over and over. And the one that I get more than any other from them is this one, which is, look, you've done all this reporting, you've made all these revelations, you've written all these stories. What has been the single most shocking revelation that you think has come from these documents? What is the most stunning disclosure? And it's actually really easy for me to answer that question. It's not difficult at all. What I always say is really what I think, which is by far the most significant disclosure that we've learned over the last 2 years is that the goal of the NSA and the United States government and ally spy agencies around the world is to collect and store, and then when they want to monitor, every single communication event that takes place electronically by and between human beings on the planet, including in the United States. The goal of the NSA, They have a motto. They have like an institutional motto. You know how like your favorite sports team has a motto, or like some state has a motto that's supposed to define who and what it is? The NSA has a motto. And this motto appears over and over again in their top secret documents. And it defines what their institutional mission is. The motto of the NSA is collect it all. It's very simple and clarifying. We probably owe them some thanks for that, but they never thought we would know it. But nonetheless, that is their motto, collect it all. And it's not collect all the terrorist communications or collect lots of communications, it's collect it all. And it's not some dystopian aspiration. It's not some far-off, unfulfilled dream that one day in 2120 they hope to achieve. They're very close to accomplishing and fulfilling that now. And the proof of that is that every single day, the NSA collects and stores billions, with a B, billions of communication records of Americans and people around the world and their communication activities that take place on the telephone and the internet. In fact, the greatest challenge the NSA had for so long, if you go and look at what they were worried about in 2009 and 2010, was that they were collecting so much information every single day about entire populations, including its own, that they literally were incapable of physically storing it anywhere. Now think about how stunning that is. Digital information can now be stored, gargantuan amounts of it, on tiny little thumb drives. So if the NSA, with all of its huge, sprawling facilities all over the world, is incapable of physically storing what they're collecting, that is a really potent indication of the mind-bending amount of data that they are collecting about innocent people every single day all over the world. And the reason I find that so stunning, the reason I say that that to me is the most significant revelation by far, is not because of the profound way that subverts privacy rights, although it does profoundly subvert privacy rights. The reason why it's so significant is because it is such a profound subversion of democracy. I mean, think about this. Whatever else your views are on surveillance, like some people stand up and say, you know what, I think it's really good that the government's reading my emails because it's kind of like my daddy figure. I want them to keep me safe from the bad people. And other people say, no, you know, I'm actually not comfortable with it. But whatever else is true about that debate, like wherever else you fall on that spectrum, it certainly is the case that if the United States government is going to take the internet, probably the most significant human innovation in decades, if not centuries, and all of the promise that it has for democratization and liberalization and evening the playing field in terms of how power is distributed among human beings, if the US government is going to take that and turn it into a realm of mass unlimited surveillance, whatever else is true, that's one of the most profoundly consequential things the US government could do, and yet it did it completely in the dark, without an iota of disclosure or debate or democratic deliberation of any kind. When I first started doing the reporting, and over the past, say, year, I've heard from, I don't know how many members of Congress, but it's been a lot, 3 or 4 dozen, probably evenly drawn from the two parties. And what they all have said to me, literally everyone who has ever contacted me or with whom I've ever spoken about this issue, they've all said the same thing, which is, and some of them, most of them actually won't say this publicly, but they certainly have said it to me, and some have said it publicly, which is, I am so grateful for these revelations because even I, as a member of Congress, had no idea that these kinds of surveillance programs even existed. These are members of Congress who had no idea that these programs even existed. And when I've gone around the world, I've spoken in the last 6 months in New Zealand and Germany and Sweden and Norway and the Netherlands. I've had members of their parliaments all say the same thing, which is, I knew nothing about any of this until I read about them in your articles. There's an op-ed from a member of the National Security Committee of the Parliament in the UK who wrote an article, an op-ed in The Guardian in October 2013 saying, my job as a member of Parliament and of this committee was to exercise oversight over the British spying agency, and yet I knew nothing about these mass surveillance programs until I read about them in the paper. There's one really amusing part of the NSA archive. It actually might be the only amusing part. There's very little amusing about the NSA archive, but this part actually amused me. The NSA has its own internal, it's like a newsletter. It's actually it's like a magazine, actually. And it's just like any other magazine that you can go buy on the newsstand, like People or Time or any other gossip rag, except that it's top secret, so very few people are ever supposed to read it. And like every other magazine, it has, like features and profiles, and then it has interviews. And the interviews are really weird to read because they are high officials within the US government speaking about things with the expectation that the public will never know what they're saying, and therefore they're actually speaking candidly and truthfully, which is a really weird experience you probably never have had, to read government officials speaking candidly and truthfully. But when they think that they're doing it in secret, that's what they do. And there's one interview that I found so stunning. We actually reported on this, and it got far less attention than I think it deserved. It was an interview with the official at the NSA who was in charge of the NSA's foreign partnerships. So the NSA has partnership agreements with the spying agencies in India or Korea or Japan or Spain or Italy or Colombia, and this is the official who oversees all of those relationships. And the interviewer actually asked him several good questions, one of which he said, you know what, most of these countries with whom we have these partnership agreements are democracies. And therefore, they go to the polls, their citizens do, and they have wildly different outcomes in their elections. Sometimes left-wing parties win, other times right-wing parties win. They have centrist parties that win. They have wild swings in political power. And yet, one thing that has always confounded me, said the interviewer, is that no matter what the outcome of the elections are in these countries, our partnership agreements with them never changes. They just continue along exactly as is. Why is that? Why is our partnership agreement, our partnership relationship, so immune to democratic change? And what the official said is that the reason they're so immune, the reason they just continue as is, despite the election outcome differences, is because virtually nobody outside of the military structure of those countries even has any idea that these partnership agreements exist, and therefore can't change what they don't know. It's really a way of saying that in all of these Western democracies, including our own, there is a government inside of a government. You have this unelected, secretive national security state that is completely immune from democratic accountability, that makes profoundly consequential decisions without any debate, let alone limitations. And then you have this shell of democracy that impotently surrounds it. And you can have the attributes and properties of a democracy. Like you can have two different political parties, and you can tell the citizens that their duty and their right is they get to go to the polls every single 4 years and check a box next to one of the two political parties and decide which of those two will wield power, and then just go about their business until they're called again 2 years later or 4 years later. But if the people who are engaged in that exercise are doing that in complete ignorance of what their government is actually doing in the most profound ways, that is a completely meaningless and empty ritual. And I think the key to that fact has been how pervasive secrecy has become. I think it's actually the key to the reporting I've been doing over the past 20 months, and I think it's actually the key ingredient as well to the abuses of the war on terror and the abuses of the war on drugs. I think secrecy is actually the key to all abuse of power, just like transparency is the ultimate disinfectant and antidote to it. And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about how pervasive secrecy has become in this country that we call a democracy. Most of you probably remember in 2010 the series of very substantial disclosures by WikiLeaks, where they published hundreds of thousands of documents detailing really atrocious and egregious conduct by the United States government and the military in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then published hundreds of thousands of diplomatic cables all throughout the world. And I remember at the time that people in Washington, in the media and in government, tried to undermine and discredit those disclosures by saying two different things, making two different arguments. On the one hand, they said, WikiLeaks and whoever their source was, who was unknown at the time, is treasonous. They've committed treason. They're traitors. They have damaged American national security and put people's lives in danger with these disclosures. They're reckless and irresponsible. And then on the other hand, they said, and also, you know, there's nothing actually new in any of these documents that reveals anything we didn't already know. It's all kind of banal. And I always found that obvious inconsistency between those two claims to be just overwhelming, and the fact that they could say them both at the same time with a straight face always struck me as significant. But those are the things they said. And the reality is that the second point, there was actually a great deal of truth to it. There were a lot of significant revelations in the WikiLeaks documents, but if you actually read through the hundreds of thousands of documents that ended up getting disclosed, the vast majority of them are just boring. They don't really reveal anything. They're just trivial, banal kind of events that happen in every workplace, including the US government. What was actually significant about those banal documents that revealed nothing is that somebody, with respect to every single one of them, stamped at the top of each page classified or secret or confidential or top secret, which meant that it was a felony for anybody to disclose them. And the same thing is true with the Snowden archive. If you read through hundreds of thousands of NSA documents, which, as you may have heard, is what I've spent the last 19 or 20 months of my life doing, the thing that will strike you the most is not that on every single page there are jaw-dropping revelations. There are on a lot of the pages, but most of the pages are just dull and inconsequential and insignificant. They are debates over what should be the menu for the lunchroom, or small, trivial employee grievances over holidays, things that happen in all of our workplaces every single day, and yet at the top of every page is stamped top secret, every single page. And what this reflects, what this demonstrates, is that our government, the US government, reflexively classifies every single thing that it does, from the most significant to the most inconsequential, as secret or top secret. It has purposely constructed a wall of secrecy behind which it functions, so that what we know about them, except in very rare cases, is virtually nothing. We have a democracy in which we exercise the right to vote in more or less utter ignorance of what the government is really doing. And I think sometimes about why that's not more of a scandal, why it's not more of a scandal that the government, not just in special cases, but in virtually every case, conceals what it's doing from the population. Just as I've spent a long time thinking about why it's not more of a scandal that the government asserts the right to target American citizens for assassination without even a shred of due process, or can put 25% of the world's population into prisons, even though we only have 5% of the world's population. And I think that the reason for this is that as citizens, we've come to think about politics and our government in a fundamentally misguided way. I think what we've come to conclude is that the reason that we need transparency and safeguards and limitations on the exercise of power is because occasionally there will be bad men or women who exercise that power, and in those specific instances, some limitations or transparency is needed, specifically when there's somebody from the party to which we don't belong who happens to win the election. Then and only then are those kinds of concerns justified or valid. And I know this a lot from my own personal experience. I began writing about politics in early 2005. And at the time, I was a constitutional lawyer, and I began writing because I was concerned about a fairly narrow range of issues involving abuse of executive power, excessive secrecy, things like putting Americans into prison without charges of any kind, even ones detained on US soil. And because it just so happened that at the time I began writing about those things, there was a Republican occupying the White House, my biggest fans by far, the people who were most enthusiastic about the work I was doing, were liberals and progressives and Democrats who thought that what I was doing was absolutely wonderful. And meanwhile, there was a group of people who thought that I was essentially the reincarnation of Satan, and those people tended to be conservatives and Republicans. And it was pretty much divided along those lines, more or less cleanly. And then starting at around, I don't know, I guess maybe like January 20th, 2009, more or less, my entire world changed. And all of these liberals and progressives and Democrats, not all of them, but a good number of them who had previously been very supportive, reconsidered and said, you know what, maybe we don't actually like him much at all. And then at the same time, I had all these new Republican and conservative friends. And it was really just, the whole world, my whole world had been turned upside down. And the reason why I say I think that's so fundamentally misguided is because the reason that people need transparency and limitations and accountability in the exercise of their political power is not because certain human beings are bad and certain human beings are good and the bad ones need limits. It's because what it means to be a human being, the essence and defining properties of human nature, mean that it is inevitable, not likely or probable, but inevitable, that power will be fundamentally abused if it's exercised without constraints and limitations and balance. And this, you know, the reason why I get the reason why sometimes it surprises me the extent to which people are willing to ignore that or even reject it is because it's so centrally embedded in what American political culture is supposed to be. If you look at what the founders said, and of course, you know, we talk about the founders as though they're some kind of monolith, like they all agreed, like the founders said. And in reality, the founders were at each other's throats and might have even been more polarized than we are today. But there were a couple of just fundamental truths on which they all agreed, and it typically had to do with these generalized recognitions about what human nature was. And of course, their central concern was we just fought this extremely bloody and draining war against the most powerful empire on the planet, and now we want to go and recreate this new centralized authority. How do we ensure that we're not going to replicate the abuses from which we just emancipated ourselves? And their answer was, we have to understand that human nature will guarantee that it does get replicated, that those abuses and those tyrannies will be repeated if there aren't all kinds of limits, not for some leaders who are bad, but for all of them. And I just want to read you a couple of quotes that just illustrate how kind of categorical that recognition was on the part of the people who formed the country, who were all taught to, if not venerate, at least consider to have had a lot of good ideas. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, "In questions of power, let no more be heard of confidence in men, but instead chain him down for mischief with the chains of the bind him down for mischief with the chains of the Constitution." And then John Adams was even more unequivocal. He said, "There is danger from all men, not all men who are Democrats or all women who are Republicans or whatever, but all men. The only maximum of a free government ought to be to trust no man living with power to endanger the public liberty." I mean, that should always be central to our mentality as citizens, which is we have these systems in place that apply not to some leaders, but to all of them. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about what, I don't even know if I have a title for this speech, but I think the title of the event has to do with the war on terror and the war on drugs, and it's a fascinatingly perfect time to have that discussion because I think it always is important to realize that no abuses ever happen in isolation. And I've spent most of my time writing about the war on terror over the last 10 years, but it's always clearly true that the precursor to the war on terror was the war on drugs. And the war on drugs is essentially fueled by the abuses of the war on terror. You really can't extricate them in any way. And just like the war on drugs overwhelmingly and disproportionately and unjustly harms communities of color in the United States, the war on terror has overwhelmingly and disproportionately harmed and targeted American Muslims. But they certainly threaten the rights of every single person. And the reason why I say it's such a perfect time to have this discussion is because, as you probably know, just 3 days ago, USA Today revealed that it's not just the NSA that had been collecting comprehensive records of Americans' phone communications, but also the Drug Enforcement Agency, which actually began back in the 1990s doing the same thing, where they were literally monitoring the calls that American citizens were making to people in 116 different countries. That was sort of the framework for how the metadata program began that ultimately got adopted by the NSA. And there's a great article in Wired by Andy Greenberg about this, and he emphasizes that you can't look at either the war on terror or the war on drugs in isolation because they're both part of the same mindset. And what he wrote was, the program, meaning the one just revealed from the DEA, serves as a reminder that most of the legal battles between government surveillance programs and the Fourth Amendment's privacy protection over the last decades have played out first on the front lines of America's war on drugs. And he quotes Chris Soghoian, who's the privacy expert from the ACLU, as saying, quote, "The war on drugs and the surveillance state are joined at the hip." You cannot talk about dismantling the abuses of the war on terror without talking about dismantling the war on drugs. And it illustrates a critical point that I think has probably been more overlooked than any other significant political issue over the last couple of decades. If you look at how the war on terror was first talked about, the focus was overwhelmingly on foreign nationals on foreign soil. We talked about imprisoning people with no charges who were on foreign soil in Afghanistan and Yemen and Somalia. We talked about assassinating foreign nationals in Pakistan and in Iraq and in numerous other places. We talked about using drones over Baghdad and Kabul. We talked about implementing systems of mass surveillance in war zones aimed at enemy populations. And what has happened over the past decade, and it's really been overlooked, is that insidiously, but inexorably, the war on terror has been imported into the United States so that it is now aimed increasingly not at foreign nationals but American citizens, not on foreign soil but on our own soil. And you see this in the rhetoric of war on terror officials. 10 years ago, they would say the greatest threat is from Al-Qaeda. And then that morphed into the greatest threat is from its affiliates, such as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And that has now morphed into what they say always is the greatest threat, which is the threat of homegrown terrorism. And you now have drones flying not over Baghdad and Kabul, but over most mid-sized and large American cities. And instead of having surveillance aimed at the entire population of Baghdad, which was first pioneered by General Keith Alexander when he was in Iraq, you now have it aimed at the entire American population. And the Patriot Act, which was enacted in the name of terrorism, has been used far more for domestic crimes having nothing to do with terrorism, including drug offenses. When you start to legitimize power abuses against more marginalized groups, foreign nationals on foreign soil, inevitably that will seep into the domestic population. That's the history of empires generally, is they abuse the populations that they conquer, and then those abuses seep into the imperial capital because the mindset itself becomes legitimized. And there are all kinds of commonalities in the mindset between the war on terror and war on drugs, most of which have to do with unwarranted trust in political leaders, the belief that violence and force is the answer to every single social pathology, and most of all, letting ourselves be placed in fear over very remote threats and causing that fear to submit to authority and to the power it seizes. That is the really toxic formula that has fed the war on terror and the war on drugs, and it's why neither can be defeated until they both are. So I just want to end with one sort of anecdote about the work I've been doing for the last 20 months. And it's an anecdote I like to share because it actually really profoundly influenced me in lots of different ways, and will probably influence how I look at the world for the rest of my life. And it's an anecdote I particularly like to share when I speak to college groups or younger people on campuses, but really pretty much everywhere I go and speak, I try and talk about this experience I had. When I went to Hong Kong with my colleague Laura Poitras in June of 2013 to meet Edward Snowden, we knew almost nothing about who it was that we were going to meet. We knew that he was somebody who had claimed to have enormous numbers of top secret documents that incriminated the US government in a campaign of mass surveillance aimed against its own population, but we knew almost nothing else about him. We didn't know his name, we didn't know where he worked, we didn't even know his gender or his race, and we definitely did not know his age. And when we got to Hong Kong and met him and saw how young he was 29 years old at the time, but he looked, probably 5 or 6 years younger than that. He looked like this sort of, like vaguely nerdish kid who you see in every grocery store, who I've seen many times already at this event. It was shocking and disorienting to us. And I remember Laura and I just being, completely confounded. And we had to spend 2 or 3 days doing extra investigation to make sure of his bona fides, that he really was who he said he was, and that he was doing it for the reasons that he said. And once we were able to determine that he was who he said he was, this realization kind of dawned on me almost instantly, which is that, Edward Snowden wasn't just some 29-year-old kid. He was somebody who was as ordinary as it gets. He grew up in a, at best, lower middle class environment. His father was in the Coast Guard for 30 years. He didn't finish high school. He was working in enormous institutions in obscure positions for big corporations like Dell or Booz Allen, or for the CIA and NSA. He was completely ordinary in every way. He had no power, no position, and no prestige. And yet, through nothing more than an act of conscience, really just an act of pure courage, Edward Snowden changed the world. He did. He literally changed the world. He changed how hundreds of millions of people think about enormous numbers of profound topics. He disrupted diplomatic relations. He radically changed how people behave on the internet. He caused new international organizations and reform movements around the world to begin. And he caused a debate for the first time about the value of individual privacy in the digital age and our relationship to the government. He changed the world. And one of the things that's so fascinating is that if you look at the most significant social change over the past several centuries, what you typically find is that the most significant social change occurs not by great leaders organizing massive movements and gaining power, but by really ordinary people just one day taking some kind of action that catalyzes massive change, whether it's Rosa Parks refusing to sit at the back of the bus one day because she had had enough and fueling this worldwide civil rights movement, or a Tunisian street vendor who just spontaneously set himself on fire in protest of long-standing Arab tyranny and spawned an extraordinary democratic revolution against the world's most entrenched despots. That really is the lesson of history. And I think the lesson of Edward Snowden and the lesson of political history is that any institution built by human beings, no matter how formidable or powerful they might seem, can be altered or undermined or torn down and replaced by other human beings if the will and the conviction and the values are summoned. And it's something that we, on some level, almost like to resist. Ever since I've been writing about politics, I've noted this kind of defeatism. Like people say, well, I feel really strongly that these injustices have occurred, but deep down I don't really believe I can do anything about them. I'm just not powerful enough to figure out what to do about them. It's almost pleasant to think that, because it kind of relieves us of the responsibility of trying, right? If we tell ourselves, well, I don't have any power against these massive institutions, you can kind of put your feet up in the comfort that you don't really have a choice. But it's actually really a fiction. That is a fraud, that defeatism. Just like people in power like to keep us divided so that we're not unified against them, they also like to convince us that we're actually impotent, that we're powerless against them. And it really is an illusion. It's a fiction. It is a fraud to think that. And I think that is what the lesson of history teaches us. And when we come to events like this and we think about things like the injustices of the war on terror and the injustices of the war on drugs, I think it's extraordinarily important not to think about those injustices in an abstract or intellectual way, but to think about the ways in which they harm huge numbers of human beings, our fellow citizens and people around the world. And then after that, to realize that although we don't have to do something as extreme as a Rosa Parks or a Tunisian street vendor or an Edward Snowden has done, that we all have the power within ourselves to make choices that reflect what our values really are and that can really make a big impact in confronting those injustices in the world. So with that, I thank you very much for listening and look forward to talking again at the panel. Thanks so much.